John Maynard Keynes was your great-great-uncle.
Yes, that is right. Yeah, it's a bit of a name drop in the middle of the book. That
It is.
I wasn't sure whether to include it, but it is. It is quite cool. So I like to mention it from time to time.
In his discography of writing, did he ever talk directly to Bayes?
You know what he did? I mean, obviously didn't talk directly in the sense of actually.
I mean, the theorem,
yeah. But his now. I didn't go into a great deal of detail about it in the book, but I mean, and I'd like to pretend that's for a better reason that I didn't fully understand it. But the Keynes wrote what I think was a kind of defense of Bayes, because he was now. Someone might write in and correct me if I've got this exactly backwards, but I think Keynes wrote a thing. One of the problems with Bayes is finding out where you get your priors from, which I dare say we'll get into at some point. And there's a lot of sort of technical arguing about whether or not it's possible to have a purely ignorant prior, where we don't know anything and we have a uniform prior everything. And I think Keynes wrote an argument saying it is possible to have this sort of ignorant prior, like a uniform prior over everything, and so that was in, I want to say general theory, but I'm at this point I'm sort of just guessing, But yeah, Keynes definitely was fully aware of Bayes, and I think was a defender. But I'm now nervous that I've completely got him backwards, and he was actually an implacable opponent. So who knows,
Do you have any sense for how much it affected his broader worldview?
For Keynes,
yes.
This is where I should be more up on family history than I am. But I think he. I mean, short answer, no. I don't know how much directly influenced him, except that he was he was a utilitarian, he was an economist, and had. If you're in economics, you can't really do sort of utility calculations without Bayes, right? You need it for.
You need priors.
Yeah, exactly. You need to have priors, and you need to update. When you were saying how likely something is to happen, all the stuff, utility times probability is your expected value and all this stuff. You need Bayes as part of the calculation for that. So it would be very surprising to me if he hadn't sort of incorporated that into his thinking. I mean, it was really a bit later than, because the real work on utility theory really fell out of sort of John von Neumann and Morgenstern, and that was, I think, in the Second World War, towards the end of Keynes's life, and probably wouldn't have become really. I might have got my timeline all muddled up here, but I think that's true. I don't think Keynes would have been fully on board with sort of mathematical utility stuff, because I don't think it would have fully overlapped with his lifetime. But the sort of the fundamentals of Bayes would have been very familiar to him, and I hope, because I think it's a really useful way of looking at the world, I hope it would have influenced him.
Do you feel like, in a sense, you're carrying the torch of the scientific writer for the family?
I tell you what, it's worse than that, because if I'm going to should I do more name dropping? Because I love to name drop.
Absolutely, why not?
Yeah. My mum's grandfather, my great grandfather, was another guy who was called A.V. Hill, Archibald Vivian Hill, brilliant name. And he was a Nobel Prize winning physiologist, and he also I think it's fair to say rescued, certainly helped a load of Jewish scientists escape Germany in the years ahead of the Second World War. So that whole side of the family is Cambridge academic royalty. Yeah. So I'm not carrying the flame. I'm a dim little candle by comparison. I cannot possibly hope to carry the flame of all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So, but I'm doing my best, right? I'm writing interesting things about hopefully interesting topics.
Tough academic pedgree to read yourself into.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned expected value. This is a two-word phrase that appears all throughout any sort of discussion of Bayes, and famously, damn it, what was his name? The effective altruist who just went to prison for the crypto scandal. Sam Bankman-Fried. He spoke all the time in expected value. This is Bayesian, right?
It is. It is a probability. It's a function of probability, and you need Bayes to do it in a complicated way. But yeah, in a way, at its most basic level, it's not. It is just the probability, if you want to work out your expected winnings on a gambling table, right? If you want to know whether a bet is a good one, you need to work out say if someone came to you and said, "I'll bet I'll give you even odds that this dice will come up at 6." So okay. You roll the dice, and if you roll the dice, what's your expected value? What's your expected winnings from that? Well, if I put £1 on it, then 5 times out of 6 I'll lose that £1, and 1 time out of 6 I'll win £1. That's, you can work out that's your expected value is, oh god, I should have chosen an easier example, but it's something like your expected value is like below 50p. So you expect to lose more money than you win, because it is the probability that you win times the amount that you win, and minus the amount that you lose on average.
Assuming it's a fair dice.
Assuming it's fair dice, yeah. And that is, you can't do any sort of calculations of how useful something is. How whether or not you should make it, whether something's a good decision. Whether it's in gambling or anything, without that sort of thinking. Whether it's investments or anything, or really like implicitly when I go to the shops. If I go to the shops, I think I'm betting that the shop has the thing I'm going for, and I think it is. I think the chance that it has it times the value of the thing when I get there, minus the cost of my time, balances out. So that is all. Yeah, that is just sort of the basics of how we work out whether something is a good bet or not. It's Bayesian insofar as you need to have a prior probability that this thing is there, and then you can update that information, update that prior probability with new information. Like I could think, oh god, I don't know if the shop has this stuff. I will look on the website, and that updates my probability, and I go along. So we are, insofar as we are always updating any best guess of a probability that we have with more information. That is the Bayesian bit. But then the moment when we sort of the probability times the utility, just for that bit you don't need Bayes on its own, but to turn it into a system of utility, you absolutely do.
So I think it's all quite intuitive. As we go throughout our lives, we're constantly making these assessments.
Yeah.
But the promise of the book is that it will fundamentally change the way you see the world. Is that by just putting a name to this process you're constantly going through, or is there something deeper that you're really trying to talk about?
Well, okay, so I think it is. It is a perspective-changing thing in a lot of ways. One thing, I mean, even the way most people come across Bayes, and I'm sure this is probably true for you. People talking about medical testing and things, that if you do a 99% accurate test and it, as in 90, it gives you the correct. It'll correctly tell you that you have the disease if you have the disease 99 times out of 100, and it'll correctly tell you that you don't have the disease if you don't have the disease 99 times out of 100. And you take the test, you get a positive result, and you say how likely you are to get the disease, and most people instinctively go, well, 99%, obviously. But what Bayes tells us is that's not true, right? You need prior probability. That's just a test. You need to update your existing beliefs with that test to give you. I mean, the example I've been trying out as a way of making it more intuitive is I say, well, imagine I do this test for a medical condition, and we know it's 99%. Only gives a false positive 1 time in 100 to people who don't have it. I get a positive result. What's the chance I have it? And you're 99%, whatever. Well, what if it was a pregnancy test, right? And I'm me, Tom Chivers, and do you really think, what is more likely? Is it that I'm really pregnant, or that I'm the 1 in 100 that got the false result, right? And I hope that makes it more intuitive, that you need to have, was this likely in the first place before you include this information? So I think that is, to some extent, that's actually, I always find that a bit hard to get my head around still, even when we're thinking about these just the sort of most basic form of Bayes, talking about medical testing and things like that. But it's important, and nothing makes sense without that consideration. Science also, you need to have it when you're dealing with people dealing with statistically significant results and so on. You don't know, if you need to have some prior probability to have some sense of how likely it is to be true. But I think the sort of real perspective changing stuff is, firstly, that what falls out of that is the fact that all probability is subjective, right? So everything, whenever you're saying I think, something is, whenever I say a dice has a 1 in 6 chance of coming up 6, that's not some fact about a sort of platonic ideal dice. That's my best guess, right, of most dice, and it's not true in it's not like some deep truth about the universe. It's just I don't have enough information to predict because I threw the dice and it'll bounce in these random ways, and I don't know how hard you spun it. So the best guess I can put on it is 1 in 6. That's my prediction. And also, I don't know if it's a fair dice. I don't know all these things, but I guess it probably is. So all probability assessments about the world are subjective. They're about our best guesses, and that's true of science. That's true of everything. So that I think is quite perspective shifting. Probability isn't some thing out there in the world, it's just a codification of our ignorance. I think that's important.
Right.
And my last thing is also, I think it's my last thing. Who knows? We'll find out if I keep talking afterwards. But my last thing is also, it's really crucial, I think, that we don't to change our mind from having to think like I have to say this thing is true or this thing is not true, to say I think this thing is X% likely to be true or X% likely to happen, and then when new information comes in, we can shift and sort of sway with the new information, sway with the breeze as it comes in, rather than doggedly defending I believe this thing to be true, I believe this state of affairs to be the case. And that allows us to more gracefully integrate new information, whereas I think instinctively we want to sort of say, yes, this thing is true, this thing is not true, and we do behave like that. We do, intuitively, like you say, like in sort of everyday life, we do make these assessments of how likely something, the shop is
just based off our experience.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't doggedly assume it is absolutely certain, and I will break down my life will stop functioning if I get to the shop and it doesn't have milk or whatever. But when we're dealing with sort of more like arguments on the internet, is what I'm always thinking of, then people do say this thing is true and this thing isn't true, rather than saying, I think this is quite likely to be true, but you could convince me with evidence that it is not.
Yeah.
And I could shift my position around. So I think that is a fairly profound perspective shift that thinking like a Bayesian can give us, and I commend it to the listener. I really do. I think it's a useful way of living.
Not to bring Keynes back in already, but didn't he once say in a debate, when the evidence changes, so will my opinion? And you said...
Yeah, he said, what was it? Well, I think this might be one of those Churchill jobs where a cool phrase gets attributed to a cool guy after the fact, and Keynes was a really cool guy. So but it was, yes, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?
Right.
Which is very cutting.
Which as well and surmises everything you were sort of just saying.
Yeah, exactly. You bring in the information and you use it to update the things you already knew, and it doesn't have to be a one moment of epiphany where I change my mind from thinking X is true to Y is true. You go from I think X is very likely to be true, but you have to leave by the nature of Bayesian mathematics and really like just life. You can never be 100% certain about anything, right? Philosophers have written
even the sun rising tomorrow. We have the
sun rising tomorrow, whether or not we are not a brain in a jar.
Confidence in it happening.
Yeah.
However, the future is inherently unpredictable.
Yeah, despite the title of my book.
Yeah, sorry about that. Maybe I'm giving a little bit away of my projection later on when I bring Nassim Taleb into it. But go on.
But you're right. But you're right. Well, the future is inherently unknowable, but you can predict it. You can predict, like each time you take a breath. This is one of the sort of comments I make early in the book. Is each time you take a breath, you're predicting that the air will continue to contain enough oxygen to maintain you. And each time you walk to the shops for prosaic examples. You predicted that I would be I would remember to log on time for this interview. Actually, you were wrong about that prediction, so apologies for that. But you know what I mean. It is you're always predicting, and most of the extent to which you progress in the world successfully is heavily dependent on how well you predict. I predict that this particular set of nerve signals my brain sends to my arm will move. Will allow me to pick up the set of headphones on my desk. It is all predictions, and some predictions are harder and some predictions are easier, or rather some predictions are more precise and some are much less. Like we can predict a solar eclipse 10,000 years in the future.
Right.
That's because there's so little chaos in the orbit of the solar system that it's very, very predictable. We can predict the weather maybe a couple of weeks out. Maybe not even that really, and gets much less reliable. It's all predictable, just more and less so.
But can we predict the way a group of 10 people are going to behave? Likely not. There's so much complexity there.
Likely not. Well, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, it depends on what bit you're predicting. If there is a bear attacking them, I confidently predict most of them will run away,
Yes.
right? But if it's deciding which particular movie to watch, I would need a lot of information about that group of people. Even then, maybe, if I knew them well and I knew that they preferred explosions and stuff to art house things about the Holocaust, then I would imagine
Let's put an Armageddon.
that I would, yeah, exactly. They go and see Armageddon rather than the Zone of Interest or something, That is. These are all predictions, but the point is, you don't just say it will or it won't happen. You say, I consider it 65% likely they'll go and see, Armageddon or Transformers, whatever. We're using very old examples here. Actually. It's showing our age a bit, but you know what I mean. And less. So it is about confidence and precision of predictions, rather than just saying some things are predictable and some things are not.
So maybe then. The sort of deeper message that you're trying to deliver the audience from the book, again, don't let me tell you what the deeper message is, but just from understanding might be that going beyond us just intuitively making sense and putting a name to what is this process we go through every day as we navigate life, making very narrow predictions about the future, is actually a emphasis on how well we're assessing the Bayesian priors. Are we right in all of these assumptions we're making? And how many of these assumptions are actually quite wrong, which we nonetheless are still relying on?
Yeah, I mean, it is how good. I mean, the whole thing is, right, how good are we at assessing prior probabilities in the first place, and then how good are we at integrating new information with the stuff we already have and applying, at deciding how much to update our beliefs on the strength of new evidence and how good new evidence is. And I mean, like, to some extent, this is sort of, it has the danger of becoming something that feels sort of almost obviously true, because that's, some people are better and worse at this stuff than others. It is just the case that we have to integrate new information. But I find it fascinating that firstly, there's a single equation that neatly mathematically describes all of this. I find that amazing. And it's a one-line equation, which has like mathematical operations that my kids could do easily. It's just, there's nothing, it's just multiplication and division. There's nothing sort of fancy about it. So I find that fascinating. Well, I mean, that's pretty much, that's what I find fascinating about it. Just this amazing thing. I thought there would be a secondly coming along there, and probably there was when I started talking. But
no worries. Let's more formally introduce Bayes' theorem here. I've got a bit of a wordy question here, so bear with me. This is from the Wall Street Journal Review. At its core, the theorem provides a quantitative method for getting incrementally wiser by continuously updating what you think you know with new information. Geologists use it to assess the Earth's composition, insurance underwriters use it to set premiums for workplace liabilities, and artillery commanders use it to aim projectiles. So, if Bayes describes the probability of an event based on prior knowledge of information relevant to that event, and I know that you're a notorious trickster with a pocket full of double-sided coins, and you asked me what are the odds when I flip this coin that it will be heads, I would therefore be silly to answer 50%.
No, so, well, that reminds me of something, I now can't remember if it was James Randi or two recently deceased sort of skeptics with large beards, James Randi or Daniel Dennett. I think it was James Randi, and he said, I'm pretty sure it was Randy. They both dabbled in stage magic, but Randy was the professional, wasn't he? So it's probably him. And he said, like, I've got 4 envelopes here. I'll put a playing card in one of them, shuffle them up, show the audience, like, what's the percentage probability that this envelope has the playing card? And the guy goes, 25%. He said, no, I'm a stage magician. It is 100%. Right. It is. The point of Bayes is that you need to use all your information. Exactly. If I asked you if you had to flip a coin and you said it's 50, what are the chances of being heads? And I knew you were the world's the owner of the world's largest collection of double-headed coins, or whatever. Then yes, I should use that information to assess the probability difference. There's not some magical thing about coins that means they are the Platonic ideal. They always have a 50-50 thing. That's not how it works. It's just you you do the best guess you can make is 50-50, and if you can make a better guess with more information, then you should. And that is absolutely the heart of it. It is just about the information you have, and how you use it, and how you can update, how you can integrate it with other bits of information. That's the whole thing, and it's just this lovely one-line equation. I think it's brilliant.
Any other fun anecdotes from the book that explains Bayes in practice, apart from COVID or coin tossing or dice, etc.?
I mean, quite a few. I mean, I will start. I imagine you've come across super forecasting before in this. No, okay, a bit, yeah. So, people try and. It is useful to predict the future, right? We've talked about that. It is useful for me to know whether shops will have milk, air will have oxygen, that sort of stuff. It is useful to, and then, but for some. There is also extremely useful to be able to predict, like, what you might call the geopolitical future, or all these sort of things. People are constantly saying, what will China do? What will what will France do? How will the war in Ukraine pan out? Or financial things like, what will the dollar be? Going to be higher or lower against the yen than it is now in 6 months' time, whatever. These are useful things that if we can make good reliable predictions of those, they are. They can make people a lot of money or avoid a lot of war or that sort of stuff. These are useful things to know. Now, there's a group of people in the early 80s. There was this guy Philip Tetlock noticed that a lot of pundits, when they made predictions, so like newspaper pundits, experts on geopolitical stuff, or advisors to the government, all this sort of stuff, they made predictions, but then they never really sort of explicit about it. So like they'd say, I don't know, this thing, increased tensions are likely or something, and it doesn't really nail you to anything.
Yeah.
And then when something, if it doesn't happen, if someone says something may happen, they're sort of silently saying it may not. On the other hand, and so there was a lot of sort of a lot of he called it vague verbiage, but also when something unexpected did happen that no one had predicted. Like the election of Gorbachev, or the appointment of Gorbachev to the Soviet Union and leader of the Soviet Union in 1984. Let's say 4, might have been 5. Everyone said, "Oh yeah, this thing that I completely failed to predict entirely proves that I was right all along." So he did an experiment to assess how good people were at predicting the future, and he got hundreds of pundits, hundreds of experts to make thousands of predictions. Literally tens of thousands of predictions, and he forced them to make them sort of time limited and explicit, so falsifiable. So like will the dollar be higher or lower against the yen than it is now on the 1st of January 2025? Something you cannot say. You can't say, you say I was right. I sort of got it right. You're either right or
yes.
You're wrong. Or like will Russia invade Ukraine? That sort of thing. And they also had them put probability estimates on it. So like if 60% likely, 80% likely, 90% likely, and they used something called the Brier score, which is an assessment. It's the same system used to assess the accuracy of weather forecasting, but it's a mathematics. It rewards you for being confident and right, and punishes you for being confident and wrong. So if you say something is 90% likely and you get it right, you get loads of reward. But if you say it's 90% likely and you get it wrong, then it punishes you. You get a worse score. Very worse score. Much worse score. Very worse score. It's dreadful English. So anyway, they do this, and the discovery at the end of it was basically that the large majority of pundits, experts, especially in the media, did little better than, or no better than chance.
Interesting.
It was essentially. The phrase he used was a dart-throwing chimpanzee.
Yeah.
I think he regretted using that phrase later, because he said actually it sort of implies everyone was completely making it up. But there were some who did no better than chance, and that was a large percentage, the majority. And then there were some who did a bit better. But there was a small fraction who did really well. They did the top 2%. He called super forecasters, and no one could see the future perfectly, but they did a lot better than everyone else at sort of. Making predictions. I mean, a lot of it was saying was being uncertain and being sort of we putting wide confidence intervals on things and so on, but also it was using lots of information, admitting the world is complicated, not having one big simple idea that explains everything. But what I found really interesting about that from the book was that a lot of what they were doing was, I mean, in some cases explicitly using Bayes rule. Like they would say, I've got this. I think it's 60% likely that Yasser Arafat was poisoned with polonium or whatever, and then they get some new information and they update it. And some of them would explicitly run the numbers. Others would just sort of think of it, would use it sort of as a background thing, like I consider this information strong and relevant and precise, so it will shift my priors a long way. I'll use this is fuzzy and low confidence, and I don't think it, so it won't shift my information. And it is. I mean, if you speak to Philip Tetlock or if you speak to super forecasters, which I have done on many occasions, they will tell you, but I think in a Bayesian way. I think this is the correct way to integrate information. One of them said to me, like, it's amazing how much of Philip Tetlock's work completely falls out of, well, she said out of E.T. Jane's work, which is a sort of Bayesian update for the 20th century. So it is. I think that is a really cool indication, or an interesting indication of just how powerful this is, and how sort of when you're trying, when you do try and use it explicitly, or at least sort of keep it in your mind when you're making predictions, it is a powerful tool, and it's not just a sort of we'll point at stuff and say it's Bayesian without actually ever using it. It can get you, it can get you places and can be useful.
For those large super forecasters, or if anyone's trying to write or say something that is making a very big prediction that has so many input variables that you need computer models to be able to take care of them all and carry them all in your head at one time,
like the climate or the financial systems.
The financial systems is such a terrific playground for this idea, because there are so many people with so many resources, all trying to just make whatever that incremental prediction is, whether it's in an hour or a day or a decade. And there is one company that's extremely famous called Renaissance Technologies, the founder of which recently passed away, Jim Simons. But they have reliably printed money for 2 or 3 decades now. And they're famous because all they do is buy data sets and employ PhD mathematicians, people who probably couldn't even read a balance sheet, but nonetheless, they just bring all of this data, millions and millions of different types of data, to then try and create some incremental prediction about the world. And so far, they're the only ones to have been able to successfully do it over a period of time, because that's the other thing. Yeah. You could be lucky over a 5-year window, and then it all goes to zero overnight.
Yeah. The interesting thing to me there, right? I'm going to segue wildly into sports. I promise you it's relevant. Okay. I don't know. It's such a sort of ongoing argument about, is this player skillful or lucky? Did he mean that? Did he mean that incredibly cool thing? Banging it top corner from the halfway line or whatever in soccer. That's sort of, and it's the same in finance. You sort of say, well, did he make loads of money this year through fluke, or is he actually skillful? Mm-hmm. And again, this is the sort of thing that Bayes lets you sort of sidestep this binary idea of either he meant it or he didn't, either he's skillful or he isn't. You can say, well, I have this subjective probability that he, on average, the average stock picker underperforms the market, because that's why the market exists, right? You're very unlikely to be better than the market overall. But then, if someone does it 1 year and hugely outperforms it, I should update my probability that they maybe have got something, but probably not that much, because half the market will outperform the market. Half of pickers or thereabouts, a bit less, will do it on any given year just by picking at random. But then if I do it again the next year, that should update my probability, and then the next year when you look at someone like Warren Buffett or your Renaissance guys, I think it's very unlikely that Warren Buffett has been lucky for 60 consecutive years or whatever it is. I think that is under my, even given a fairly low starting probability that any individual stock picker is really beating the market through skill, over time I can really update that with this consistent new information. Or like if some, I don't know, Leo Messi is the obvious example, but whoever, like Novak Djokovic, you watch someone consistently being better than people around them, consistently outperforming people around them for a long time, and you can start saying, I think their success is based on skill rather than luck. And when they do something really skillful, like, you can say, I think it is more likely that he did that or she did that by skill than I would if it was a clogger like me who can barely hold a tennis racket by the right end, that sort of stuff. So it is exactly that it allows you to decide to assess skill in this more graceful way, and it is also, like as you're saying, it is a useful tool in its own right. Like for if you've got a prior probability that any particular stock is going to outperform the market, which presumably is 50%, right? I don't know, but I imagine that's how it works. Then you get information, and you integrate that with your previous things, and the information can be: do I trust the leadership team? Do I, have they got years? Have they been outperforming previously? Have other stock pickers, wisdom of the crowds is a thing. Have other stock pickers decided that they're doing well? And that is, again, it's all Bayesian. It's just adding information in to the information you already have, and using it to come up with new probability setting.
So you mentioned the super forecasters as an anecdote from the book to describe Bayes in practice. Is there one more that we could pull out?
Oh, let's have a think. I should be able to come up with one off the top of my head.
Do COVID if you feel like that's a good one, because that is obviously an extremely relatable one that everyone went through. Everyone went through the dance of the masks and then the tests and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I can tell you why I wrote the book, which is pure spite, because I wrote in my last book. I've written 3 books now. All 3 of them have. Yeah. All three of my books have at least had a chapter on Bayes, and one of them is a whole book about Bayes. Mm-hmm. The second one came out just after, early 2021. So COVID was just when I pitched the book, COVID was just on the horizon, and it was very much, by the time I was writing it, it was all during lockdown and everything. And I wrote a piece for The Observer, cribbing off one of the chapters for it, which were, so The Observer's a UK newspaper, and the piece was about testing, about COVID testing, and it was, if you have an LFT or some test like that. I'll tell you what it was about. It was about passport. There was an idea of doing COVID passports, which would be to allow people out into the world if they had been shown to have the disease, have had the disease and therefore have antibodies to it, was the idea. This was before people realised that you could actually get COVID several times quite easily. So it was the whole idea was doomed to fail to begin with. But like I pointed out that when these things were happening early on, there was maybe one person in 3, or maybe probably less than that. It was like maybe one person in every 10 had COVID, maybe even less, maybe like 1%. And these tests that they were coming out they weren't brilliant, right? They were sort of like they were antibody tests to show whether people had already had the disease, and they were like, I think they were saying like 95%. 95% true positive. So they'd only return a false positive one time in 20, which sounds pretty good. But then when you've got this population that actually hasn't had very much COVID by that stage, if you run Bayes' rule over it, it meant that roughly, I think it ended up being like a third of the people your test says have had COVID wouldn't have done. And so you'd be sending out like millions of people, literally probably millions of people out into the world saying, yeah, you're fine, go and hug your immunocompromised grannies, which would have been a complete disaster. Yeah. But anyway, so I wrote that piece for The Observer, and the editor, it was about, you're saying it's about Bayes' theorem, and quoting other things as well, and the editor pretty reasonably, but he put on a subheading, like a little like an intro thing saying how this obscure theorem or something like that. And it went mental. Like I got so many people yelling, Bayes' theorem is obscure, how dare be sort of professors of biostatistics.
It's funny that it can be so controversial.
I know, it's bonkers. Yeah. It's bonkers. Like I know about Bayes because I'm a science writer, and I have been for 15 years, 17 years, whatever it is. This is the stuff I write. I know it is an extremely important and well-known thing, but 90% of the population haven't heard of it, right? So I didn't feel... Anyway, so I got absolutely yelled at for ages, and 2 days later I submitted a book proposal for a book about Bayes, just sort of like, I'll just show you.
Yeah, that's
I know. Yeah, exactly.
It's funny how many books came out of a very viral article or blog post. Sam Leith wrote a huge bestseller called You Talking to Me. And it was him analyzing Obama from a theoretical... It was him...
Rhetorical thing.
Exactly.
His rhetoric is his stuff, isn't it?
Exactly. And that was a piece that just went bonkers. And it turned out, there's a very successful book in there. Yours the same with Bayes. I mean, there must be so many examples like that.
There are. Well, a friend of mine, James Ball, used to be at The Guardian and BuzzFeed with me, actually. And he wrote a book about... It was just like a jokey thing, but he did a tweet about massively overanalyzing pop songs, and he did a couple of tweets. They did tens of thousands of things, and he got offered a book deal off the back of it. So yeah, I mean, I guess it's a sign that some subset of people is interested in it. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I'm going to be all Bayesian about it, that is new information which you can add to your prior probability that some given idea is worthwhile or not. If loads of people are tweeting about it, then that is information, right?
And just a definition, when you say Bayesian prior, or when someone hears that in the world, that's literally just referring to the experience that you've learnt, or that the group has learnt, that informs your decision.
That is your current. I mean, that is your current best guess. Like in very simple terms. I mean, the one thing, right? Some people do use the word Bayesian, praise Bayesian prior, or my priors, kind of in the same way that someone before would have said my opinion, or this is what I believe, and it's a slightly more technical. And I worry sometimes that you can be a bit too sort of, I'll use this fancier word in an attempt to sound more technical,
yes, exactly.
But I'm really just saying this is what I think.
Exactly. According to Bayesian priors.
Yes, exactly. It sounds so much more authoritative than what I think. A Bayesian prior at its most basic, right, its most simple is this is how likely something is to happen. It can be like a percentage estimate, like a 75% likely, or it could be a probability distribution on a graph, like a bell curve on a graph over at some point on the graph, which you get new information, you shift the graph to the curve on the graph to a different place. So that is what it is. And then you think about, when you say like my Bayesian prior is that artificial intelligence will replace lots of jobs in the next few years, you're sort of saying I think this thing is likely, but I can update it with new information as as either jobs are or aren't replaced or whatever, So it is. I mean, I tend to think of it as just your best current guess with the information you have. Yep. It's nothing fancier than that.
No, exactly. From the minute that I expect this car will stop at the red light, so I can then go forward all the way through to, the super forecaster. If I put my money,
exactly, to all sorts of stuff. To like, I expect the Large Hadron Collider will detect the Higgs boson. It can be as quotidian or as abstruse as you like. It is just what I think.
So I alluded to this fella earlier, Nassim Taleb. He has a line from one of his books, which is, how can you predict a future of infinite possibilities based off a finite experience of the past? And clearly Taleb is super informed of Bayes' theorem, and even Cardano and several characters you write about, he as well writes about. He's also talking about chance, randomness, and possibility, and so forth. Yeah. But it feels like you two do differ from a worldview perspective when it comes to actually what do you do with all this information? Because Taleb says, with all of this information, we can obviously still make predictions about the future, but we should just be extremely humble about the potential, he calls it a black swan, but the potential downside, which could be maybe that car just runs the red light. So you just can't fully rely on it. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. I think it is fair to say, I mean, I don't want to put myself forward as like, I'm in some feud with Nassim Nicholas Taleb, partly because I'm quite scared of him. But
rightly so. He's a frightening fellow. Exactly. You don't want to get in his bad side. He feels like he holds a grudge for generations.
Precisely that. Love you, Mr. Taleb. Definitely. Please don't come and throw eggs at my house or anything. But yeah. So I think that it is fair to say that my position would be that yes, of course, unpredictable things happen. But to take that example with the car, if we were to say the car might go through the red light, therefore, so what can I just not move? I mean, you take into account the probability of something unexpected and terrible happening, and that's just part of your assessment. That's just there's not like some mystical difference between the unpredictable and the predictable. There's just some things are more and less predictable, and some things are worse outcomes than others. So you have to take them into account more seriously. Like being hit by a car would be really bad, So I therefore will take greater precautions, even though the probability is lower, and so maybe I'll go through slower through my green light in the sort of to be confident that he won't just zoom off,
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean I can't predict it. And also, like, you are right. He is right that there is an infinite range of possibilities, and we only have a finite amount of information and finite brain power and finite all this sort of stuff. We cannot predict every outcome.
We can only capture such a sliver of the experience that might inform our next decision.
That's true, but we can still we can make a pretty good job of it most of the time. I agree it is perfectly possible that right now NASA's satellites have all missed an Earth-killing asteroid that's just going to come and smash down on my house in the next 30 seconds. Yeah. If I knew about that, I would do something. I would go and tell my wife I love her, or something like that. I wouldn't be here talking to you. But I accept that there is a space in my sort of probability distribution for the really unexpected and terrible. But it's a small space usually because my and so I will keep that there for. As a possibility, but it's not. I don't have to throw my entire constantly be on the lookout for the black swans. And I read Black Swan many years ago now, must be 20 years nearly, and it's a really interesting book and it's really good. And he there are points he makes about sort of he calls it anti-fragile, doesn't he? But about being able to prepare yourself and make the most of. Positive black swans when they come along, and making yourself resilient to the negative ones, and I think these are all very reasonable points. But there's people use this phrase. I didn't talk about it in the book, but people have said to me in discussions about it. About Knightian uncertainty, and this is what I think Mervyn King, former Bank of England governor, talks about. When you sometimes just say I don't know, instead of saying is it instead of saying I think it's X% likely that something is going to happen. And I think, well, where does that get us? What does that help? How does that help?
Yeah.
I say it's very hard to predict by all means, and some things are more difficult than others. But sort of saying there's some category of things that are just these are unknowable and therefore we cannot predict them is kind of like saying, well, it's kind of giving up.
Yeah, you wrote
it just seems
a very scathing title for a review of I think it's called Radical Uncertainty, that Mervyn King book.
Mervyn King's book,
called Are Economists Really This Stupid?
Yeah. I didn't put that headline on it, but I do quite like that headline. Okay, so nice. I'm not going to do that. I didn't write that. So it made me laugh. But yeah, I mean that was exactly that. Like he was sort of saying, just when about various things, it was Obama's the idea he kept coming back to was Obama authorizing the assassination of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad in Pakistan, yeah. And he was saying, that you couldn't know whether bin Laden was in there. He just had Obama just had to say it's 50-50. We don't know. It could be in there. But I mean, fine. You in that particular, if you think that's your best guess, then fine. But you don't have to. You're obviously not saying he's just as likely to be in this house as any other house in Pakistan.
Right.
There's 30 million houses or whatever in Pakistan. You're not just guessing. You've got reasons to think he's there. You've made a real good effort to get information you can. There's people you've updated your information, and maybe 50-50 is your best guess, but you're still doing your best to find stuff out. And I don't know, just sort of washing your hands and saying, "Oh, I don't know," it doesn't seem helpful to me. But maybe that's just a mindset difference, rather than some.
We operate with opacity all the time, and in that particular example, the stakes are so much higher than if it was just you stopping at the red light. And yeah, some people just. That's the heavy is the crown of someone with that type of responsibility and that type of position, and they just have to maybe own that uncertainty and say, this is just
That's the best, my best
there's a
guess,
cost
right?
of the job actually to be in these sort of positions.
But I tell you what, this is the important thing, right? I had my book launch a few weeks ago, and it was with David Spiegelhalter, who's a statistician here in the UK, and he's brilliant. He's a great guy. But one of the points that he made, and I hope I have made clear enough in the book, is that you need to keep your probability estimate and your utility estimate function, whatever it is, separate. You need to say, like, when you're saying this thing will have a really good or bad outcome, that's important. That's a part of your value your expected value calculation. You'd say, it's really, it will really, if I get this wrong, it's really bad. If I get it right, it's really good. That matters, but it shouldn't affect your probability estimate. Like, you've got to keep them separate. Because if you're saying it's really important, therefore I want it to be true, therefore I will sort of convince myself that it's more likely to be true, you'll bugger up your whole system. You'll completely so you need to very carefully keep the idea of how probable do I think this thing is totally separate from how important do I think this thing is, how big, and you are right. It is for Obama. That is the heavy is the head that wears the crown and all that. The incredible responsibility of decision making and leadership there. But on the other hand, he's the fact that it's really important and has these huge momentous consequences shouldn't affect how likely he thinks it is to be true, and that is it's very hard for it. That's a really crucial distinction we need to keep. That is important to keep separate in our real lives as well. Like, just because we'd like something to be true does not make it more likely to be true.
Yeah, I think I actually maybe misrepresented the divide between you and Taleb, because as you were just talking, I remembered there's an anecdote or a metaphor rather that at the end of Fooled by Randomness, his first book, which he tells. Yeah. And the point of the metaphor is just, even in the face of all of this uncertainty, we still continue to behave nonetheless. Just the way to think about it is luck will help some people and destroy others. So it's the blindfold metaphor of crossing the road. 10 people line up, they put on the blindfold, they cross the road. Some people will make it to the other side just out of sheer luck, right? And the other side in this case could be they are successful at getting the job, successful at selling the book, whatever, successful at finding the right partner in life. But Taleb says, but I can take off my blindfold and then with my sensory inputs make sense of the world and hopefully make it to the other side. I still may be taken out, such is the role of luck in everything. But tell me if you think that's a fair sort of coming together of the worldview of you and Taleb, or whether I'm as well just forcing that.
No, I mean, I don't think, I think there's always going to be a lot of overlap between our positions because a lot of this is kind of unavoidable. We obviously do navigate the world pretty successfully using information and using prior probabilities, as in the stuff we already believed, which was, I guess, prior information.
Bayesian priors.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And we navigate the world successfully. I successfully log on to work each morning. I successfully keep my children fed. And most of us do get through the world without falling under buses or anything. So I think it is pretty unavoidable both that Taleb and I would agree on. The large majority of it's sort of just. I guess it will be an emphasis thing, right? An emphasis that, do we emphasize the predictability of the world, or do we emphasize the fact that every so often his big thing is the power law, isn't it?
Definitely. That he moving away from Gaussian distribution into much more extreme, closer to reality, fat-tailed distribution.
Yeah, exactly. So his thinking is that, when we talk about earthquakes or terror attacks and things, they don't cluster around so they're not normally distributed around a sort of an average-sized terror attack. Most of them are tiny and pathetic, and they get some of them are a bit bigger and some of them are a bit bigger, but they get rarer and rarer as they get bigger. But that leaves open the possibility of a very rare but catastrophically huge one. And same with earthquakes, and same with everything else. And that's true. It's obviously true. It's obviously I cannot. It's not that I'm disagreeing with that obvious statement. I do, but I don't think, and I don't imagine Taleb would disagree that. You can use that information to predict the future, though, right? That is a prediction of the future. I predict that there is this percentage chance of a really catastrophic terror attack or earthquake or asteroid or whatever. Asteroids impact another power law job. What I would say is that absolutely is a real probability, a real risk, but it's still a thing that to some extent we can put predictions on. We can put the prediction of you could probably put a not crazy probability of chance of a terror attack that kills 1 million people in the Western world in a given year, because we have that power law distribution. It wouldn't be like just correct in any sense, but it would be our best guess, and it would be a more or less reasonable best guess depending on how well we'd assessed the previous information. So I just think I do think you can take into account the big and unforeseen and big and harder to foresee events as part of your predictions without saying, just washing your hands and saying nothing. We can't do anything about this, so let's just say we don't know. I think that might be. Although it's been so long since I read Taleb that I'm misrepresenting him as well, and maybe he would agree with everything I've just said. I don't know.
We'll see. Are there any counterintuitive or surprising aspects of Bayes you uncovered whilst researching the book?
I mean, it's all counterintuitive, right? It is just something, or rather, well, yeah, it is all counterintuitive. The idea that somehow a 99% accurate test doesn't mean getting a positive on a 99% accurate test doesn't mean you're 99% likely to have the condition.
Yeah, that's a great
feels
example.
Counterintuitive. Yeah, exactly. But our one of our more recent, in fact, it's out the day of recording. My friend and I do a podcast together about science and statistics, and our most recent one was about the prosecutor's fallacy. So, how likely, and this is absolutely a Bayesian thing. There was a horrible court case in the UK 20 years or so ago about a woman called Sally Clark who was convicted of murdering her 2 babies because they both died of cot death within a few weeks of birth. It's just a horrible, horrible thing. But anyway, she was convicted partly, I don't want to oversimplify things because there's a lot more to it, but it's partly on the basis that a paediatrician said the chance of one case of cot death in the family is about 1 in 8,500. So the chance of 2 is 8,500 times 8,500. Therefore, which is 1 in 73 million. And it was sort of implied, I don't know if it was ever explicitly stated, but implied, and that is therefore the probability that she is innocent.
Interesting.
Right? But
then you divide that by the world population over the amount of time, now you can make a case for her innocence.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, it's worse than that because actually, obviously, cot deaths correlate in the family, so the odds of it, the 73 million odds was orders of magnitude too high. But yeah, exactly. You need to take into account firstly you need to take into account prior probability that someone is a murderer, a child murderer, and that is even less likely than mercifully than cot death. And so it is. You need to take in prior probabilities like that, and the fact that they didn't, that they sort of assumed that this is the classic thing, the idea that a 1 in 73 million chance of seeing a result by chance is not the same as a 1 in 73 million chance that the result is a fluke, is a chance, right? That they are opposite questions. Is the same mistake as saying only 1 in 8 billion humans is the Pope. Therefore, there's only a 1 in 8 billion chance that the Pope is human.
Right.
So it is. So the prosecutor's fallacy, as it's called, is sort of saying there's only a tiny chance of seeing this, getting a DNA match with the suspect if they weren't there. Therefore, there's only a tiny chance that the suspect is innocent, or there is only this tiny 1 in millions chance that this number of clusters of deaths in a hospital or whatever would happen at the same time. Therefore, there's only a 1 in several billion chance that this wasn't a bunch of murders. But that is the same mistake, exactly the same mistake as that idea that I've got a 99% accurate test on my this medical test, and that means there's a 99% chance that I haven't got the disease. It's exactly the same thing, and it like I say, it's common enough in courts that it has its own name of the prosecutor's fallacy, and there have been a lot of court cases that have turned on them and been overturned on appeal.
How did the COTS case play out?
It's horrible. She was acquitted on appeal after 3 years in jail after the second of her kids' deaths, but she died on her own of alcohol poisoning a few years later, because understandably her life was completely ruined by the fact that her 2 kids had died, and then she was jailed for it.
Christ.
So it's just I can't think about it for very long, so I just sort of I sort of skate over it as quickly as I can. You know?
Something which really stood out to me was the role of Bayes being at the bottom of all of these LLMs. So I'd just love to hear you talk about that.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. So to some extent, right, anything that does any predicting is working off Bayes, right? It has to be. Like it is the mathematical description of prediction. Anything that is predicting stuff well is doing so insofar as it's approximating Bayes, and insofar it's predicting things badly insofar as it is not approximating Bayes. So there's an element of sort of this being tautologically true, but like when you ask an LLM, when you type into an LLM, I don't know, how are you? And it says, I'm very well, thank you. It's not saying that because it is very well, and we assume, right? It is saying it because it has learned from its training data that sort of string of characters is the sort of thing that follows the string, how are you? You know? So if it may also have said, very well, thank you, I'm, great, cheers, not so bad, but these are the sort of things that that come, but like, it has only got that from training. When they first switched on the LLM in the very and they hadn't given it any training data at all, and you typed in how are you, presumably it would have returned essentially a random string of letters or random, maybe words. I don't know exactly what its sort of bottom layer tokens are, but it would not have come back. Well, it would have only a 1 in billions upon billions chance of coming back with how are you, because it just that would have been a very response. Unlikely string. Yeah, exactly. But then if you train it on basically the whole internet, and it looks at the millions of other times people have said on Twitter, like, how are you? I'm all right, then it will have learned that sort of thing is that sort of statement is followed by this sort of statement. And that is absolutely a Bayesian process, as it will have been sort of each round of training data goes in, it will slowly update, and then it knows also the different things it might say to, do you want a cup of tea? And again, it will probably say, yes, thanks, 2 sugars. I don't know. Which again, it probably doesn't want a cup of tea with 2 sugars, but it knows that's the sort of thing that follow it. So yeah. So again, this is just you can mathematically draw this out like with sort of simpler AIs like the ones. Which when I was writing my first book, which really doesn't feel very long ago, it was only 2017. It was still a big deal back then that you could get an AI that could reliably tell the difference between a dog and a cat. Right.
Yeah, I remember.
Bonkers how far it's got. Yeah. In the book, I give an example of a much simpler AI that just you give it 3. It's trying to work out pictures that are either of lions, rats, or dogs, and you give it loads of training data and it sloshes it around. Before you give it a picture, its prior probability presumably is 0.33 that a given picture is a cat or a lion or a dog. If it knows they're all those are all there, and then it sees the picture, it uses that new information and it updates its probability to 0.99 that it's a cat or a dog or a lion, or and that is purely Bayesian. And you can absolutely describe it with lines of least squares and all that sort of stuff. But any AI will be absolutely running off a Bayesian system underneath it. There are what we call explicitly Bayesian models, but which because most of these AIs will be sort of Bayes itself is so computationally demanding, because there's so many different bits of information. There's
it can't be expected to read the entire training data with each additional letter that comes out.
Exactly. But there are sort of shortcuts that you can use, sort of heuristics that can shortcut it. And there are sort of explicitly Bayesian ones which do the actual calculation. Most of them are now, but pretty much all. Just by the nature of it, anything that does any prediction is going to be Bayesian, and AIs are prediction engines. I will say, right, slightly to go off on my own hobby horse about something here,
please.
Which is like, I get annoyed because sometimes people say that AIs are just predicting, that they're just predicting what the next sequence is, or just predicting what a human would want to see when we ask it to draw this, to tell a short story about a man who's put a peanut butter sandwich in his video recorder or something. They are just predicting that, but you can put the word "just" before anything, right? I can say he's just running the 100 meters in 9.6 seconds, and actually that's really impressive. And I think the point that is crucial to remember is that predicting stuff is a lot of understanding it. A lot, like when we say we understand somebody, to a large degree, we're kind of saying we know what they will do in a given situation. Yeah. We know how they will react to stimuli and all that sort of stuff. That is a lot of what understanding is. There might be more subtleties, but that's a good starting point. And AIs that can predict what humans want and how humans would speak and all that sort of stuff, they are doing something that gets complicated, if you want to say it's not intelligence, it's not creativity, because it's so prediction is such a huge part of those things. I find there's also, there were a couple of really, I discuss it in the US edition but not the UK edition. I don't know which ones
probably
you have in
UK.
Australia.
Whichever one went to Australia.
Probably UK.
That's my Audible account.
Yeah. So there's a little extra chapter we put in the US edition about which I keep meaning to turn into a standalone essay. But there is some really interesting evidence that LLMs, in order to predict the world, make models of the world. They're not just it's not just boring surface statistics. They when they did an experiment with Othello, how the game Othello, and used something a generative AI very like an LLM to do it, and they through clever experimentation showed that it wasn't just predicting what other game players had done. It had built a model of the board in its mind somewhere and was using it to sort of, because if you want to make good predictions, it helps to have a model of the thing, to understand a thing. So I get very annoyed when people say, oh, it's just a stochastic parrot or whatever. It's just
you want people to appreciate just how
things.
phenomenal it is.
It's insane to me. Like I can't. I don't have the reserves of world weariness and cynicism required to be like, oh, it's just
well put.
I'm blown away by this stuff,
Okay, so if these LLMs are simply a prediction based off whatever the training data is that it's learned from, what are the limitations to the types of responses we can get from these LLMs?
Well, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this stuff, but I don't. I think there'll be predictions. There'll be limits because there's only training off text will only get you so far, and they're running out of text, and there probably is limits to to how the last few years of AI, as I understand it, have been driven by the discovery that it's called Google engineers called it the unreasonable effectiveness of data, right? So that it just turns out that giving these things absolutely tons of data lets you do much better AI than much better outcomes than previously realized. So a million inputs in your training data go so far, but 1 trillion and suddenly we're really talking. That actually makes a huge difference. My vague understanding, and again, I'm not an expert. I'm a guy who's spoken to some people who are over the years, but they are bumping up against the limits of how much extra data there actually is, and secondly, how much just adding more data will continue to help. And they're going to have to be starting adding different things like ways of making it learn better from less data. That's going to be a really crucial thing, because humans don't need anywhere near as much data.
But rather, my question is, say for instance, it was to read all of your books, listen to every single speech, read all your texts, all your emails, record years of you talking to all your friends and everything. Theoretically, it would be able to reproduce your exact style of speech, from everything down to the way you might stutter, to how you might take a break between syllables. Like, theoretically, that would be possible. But would you suggest that that's still a limitation of the LLMs, since it's just going to come down to access to the data and the computational costs? Or is there something a little bit bigger? Because as you know, I mean, you're a journalist. If the LLM is that good, it's very threatening to you. But
very
is it
threatening.
ever going to
Yeah.
be that good, or at least in our lifetime?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how big a market there will be for LLMs that speak exactly like me, but I do think there will be I do, and also that will be, whether or not it'll be able to completely reproduce me to the point that people. Maybe it already does. Let
me put it differently then. Earlier on, my wife was editing some text. She's she's not a native English speaker, and she put it through ChatGPT, and the text I had in front of me was very obviously written by an LLM, and so they seem to reuse the same style of talking.
They do,
and it's just not very good. The language that the two of us can use on this conversation is so much more natural and human. And so this is more what I'm trying to get at. I don't expect you to have the answers. It's more just,
where are my thoughts on it? Yeah. So I agree that there's a real sort of undergraduate essay quality to them, where they reuse particular phrases, none of which I can remember at the moment. I will say though, right? They only came out 2 years since ChatGPT came out. This is not. We don't. I think it'll be surprising if in 5 years there aren't vastly better versions of it, and 10 years again. I do think this is going to be a big deal. We haven't really had machines, anything that comes close to being a non-human intelligence on Earth before. Like chimpanzees and dolphins. No offense to them, not quite the same thing. But so it is. These things have capabilities that we just haven't seen. I do think it is going to be, and the moment they're not that great. But then, if you look at the AIs that were creating images 3 years ago, they're rubbish, and now they're amazing, and now they do that Sora business.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, the rate of progress is astonishing. I hope I've made it far enough through my journalistic career that I won't be completely outsourced by the time before I retire. But it's going to really change how we do our jobs. Maybe it'll mean they need fewer of us, because you can create but one journalist can create loads and loads of content and then find the best bits.
And
rather
stuff. Like the idea generation is more valuable versus the text itself.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm subscribed to actually a bunch of the Semaphore newsletters. I think they're great because it's just 10 stories from around the world on whatever this particular newsletter is you subscribe to. And my sense is that, that with a really good LLM could be AI. Oh, yeah. But, I mean...
don't give my bosses ideas.
No. But then, to hear Christopher Hitchens give a speech on Marxism... there's this incredibly famous one that he did back in the day. I feel like it's almost inconceivable an LLM could do such a good job at delivering so much emotion, making it so relevant and accurate. Forget accuracy. So relevant and memorable.
Sort of heartfelt.
It's phenomenal. I forget who else was on the stage, but it was a capitalism versus Marxism debate. And this is back before Hitch switched sides.
Shifted.
And he was a hardcore revolutionary. But it's really good.
Yeah. I mean, the trouble... What is interesting, right, is that a lot of why it's so impactful to us is because we know that the person behind it is a person like us who has feelings like ours, and this represents real feelings. So... it is going to be complicated which I think they will. Like AIs are capable of making. I'm sure they could make a speech. In a few years, I'm sure they could make a speech extolling the virtues of Marxism, which is just as powerful and just as powerful. It's not. The point is, it might not be as powerful, but it would be just as
effective.
It'll be just as eloquent, and just as its emphases and pauses and sort of all these things will be. Its use of rhetoric will be just as good in some sense, but it will leave us cold because we won't know that we won't have a sense that there's a human behind it. And I think that's true of any art as well. that there is some point in which we want it to be a connection between two human souls, for want of a better word.
We want to know that
yeah.
a fellow human could create this. We're already impressed by the computers. You need to impress us more. We want to be impressed by humans. Like some of this AI art, I remember I follow a bunch of pages on Twitter that produce in the style of a famous artist. And God, some of them are so good. You know, in a second, I would hang that on my wall if I could, you know, afford or figure out how to actually get it. But I do feel like maybe I wouldn't want to, because I know that this was just ones and zeros with a bunch of Bayesian priors.
I mean, that's the thing. It is super impressive, but there is we know it'll never not be the case that we crave human connection, and part of art and part of things like that are about a human speaking to other humans. You know, you read, I don't know, Primo Levi or something like that, and the point is, this is someone who went through this awful stuff, and you are trying to put yourself inside their mindset, and it, or you know, any great piece of literature, they're sort of trying to make you feel something that someone else has felt, you know, and it is not going to be the same when an LLM writes an incredibly beautiful piece, because you know that the LLM hasn't, in the intelligence that they have. I think that they're it's very hard not to describe them as to define intelligence in such a way that includes humans but excludes AIs, but they are nonetheless, they're very alien, and they don't feel, I assume they don't feel anything, and they don't have inner lives. You know, honestly, like I've some people at like DeepMind and that they seem to think they do. You know, there are people in AI companies who do definitely think that they do.
If they're training with these Bayesian priors of a bunch of emotional responses to things, why couldn't they also predict a feeling that is relevant and so forth? Yeah,
I mean that's true. You know, but is it they predict the thing to say that evokes that feeling, or is it they have in some sense created an internal world in which they have?
Well, I wonder,
my own.
If there's a morality in their training data, can they then that morality will then, by definition, also be included in their predictive responses to a degree, without setting rules?
Yeah,
you know, without saying you can't talk about Nazis. You could still ask it, was Adolf Hitler a figure for good, and it would presumably, without all the rules on it, still say, you know what, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting thing, is that because you trained it on this massive. So firstly, there's I can't remember the different kinds of training. You train it on the huge training data, but then they have a bunch of humans basically go through its responses and sort of reward or punish it for when it says, you know, we say, was Adolf Hitler good? I'm sure you can find lots of people on the internet who say he was, and then so that means there's a percentage chance that the LLM will say that, and then there's the AI will say. The AI trainer will it's called reinforcement, RLHF, I think it's called, and I can't remember exactly what it stands for. So reinforcement training, and they will go through it and say, when we ask you this thing, no, don't reply like that. You know, don't when we ask you, are there, I don't know, should women be doctors, and the AI goes, oh no, definitely not, and you go, no, we don't say that, please. A form of morality sort of falls out of it, but you have a lot of the work is making sure that it's creating a morality that we actually want. I remember my first book was about AI, people who worry that AI will kill everyone, which is a conversation in its own right, and I don't want to make it sound like it's a crazy idea, because I don't think it's crazy, right? But I don't think it's I'm not one of the people who thinks it's definitely going to happen, but I don't think it's a completely crazy thing to worry about. But they did say that this is. They used to call it philosophy with a deadline. You know, like you're doing moral philosophy with which we spent 3,000 years arguing about, but you've got like a few years before someone invents a really powerful AI, and we need to have it in place by then.
Tom, 10 minutes left. You're writing for Semaphore now. Okay. You've published several books. Has your career in journalism been a random walk, or has there been sort of intentional direction behind it?
Oh man, that's a good question. A bit of both. Like I don't want to completely deny myself having any agency, right? I was always interested in science, and I was lucky enough to get into like into mainstream journalism in my mid to late 20s, well, mid 20s really, and just aimed for being the sciencey guy because I was interested in it, and most people in journalism aren't, and I could multiply two numbers together, and most people in journalism can't, to be honest. And so so I could sort of shepherd myself towards that. I was always good at. I could write okay, and I can understand the concept. So I pushed myself towards the sort of more sciencey end of things. But then other bits like the fact that I got 2 weeks work experience early on in my career is me being lucky, right, and having connections and all that sort of stuff. So there's elements of just fluke, and then there's another things like I when people come and offer me jobs, I'm very bad at saying no to it. So I end up sort of I bounce from one to the next when someone comes because I'm too polite to say no. So I just keep being too English to stay in one job after the next. So there is an element of randomness when I now I'm at BuzzFeed. When did that happen? And that, but I don't know whether that is truly just randomness or me being me broadly making okay decisions that seem to have worked out. So from the inside it felt pretty random, but I guess from the outside it looks like I'm doing this stuff on purpose. I don't know.
Are there any moments of serendipity that stand out?
Yeah, I do think that. Well, right at the beginning, there was I'd been doing a PhD in the ethics of science journalism actually because I was bonkers. I was a philosophy graduate, and I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And I was like, I don't want to leave university; it's scary out there, so I'll stick it out. But that fell apart because I didn't really know what I was doing. And that right at the beginning, when I came out of that, I have to get a proper job. Like this is such like privileged stuff, but like a friend. My cousin's friend's husband worked for a national newspaper, and they said, "Oh, come and try it out for a couple of weeks, and like on our online desk. And if you're not completely stupid, maybe we'll give you some shifts." And I turned out not to be completely stupid, so that was a big deal. And then, like, from there were, and then at the Telegraph, there were just like I was always trying to write fun. This was the Telegraph, was the newspaper, and there were just like people would. I was just trying to push myself into places where I could write about stuff that interested me, and at every stage there were just sort of people who I owe my career to now. I said, "Oh, this just happened to read it. This is interesting. Come along and have a go at this." So yes, there were moments of serendipity. I think that very beginning one, and then there were a couple of times when people like when the Telegraph then stopped employing. This might be very boring, and I apologise if so. But there was a point when I was just as a casual, like a like an in-house freelancer, basically, and they stopped employing those for a while, and I had to go and try and get another job. But for the year that I was doing stuff at another London publication, my old bosses from there sort of kept tabs on me and just made sure that when I came out of that and there was a chance to rehire me, they sort of kept an eye on me. And that, like, a couple of things like that, and overlooking massive screw ups and so on that I made because I was a young guy. Nice. Doing and stupid. Like, yeah, I just so I don't know. I'm not giving a very good story of it being like here's just one moment where I stumbled into it all, but it was all just like yeah, exactly. But it was all very much there were like there were good people around me who stopped me from screwing my life up and pushed me down the right courses, and I hope I've rewarded them sufficiently by then having an okay career.
Well, you're a profiled writer on Semaphore. I think you even own one of the newsletters, right?
Yeah, the daily flagship newspaper. I'm the lead writer on that. That's
that's presumably project. Tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands of subscribers. So lots and lots of people.
Yeah, 100 and I lost count. I haven't checked for a while, but in the mid 100,000, so 100 and something thousand,
huge,
140,
a huge megaphone to many people around the world once a week, plus
once a day, twice a day.
Oh Christ, twice a day. Forgive me. And then now,
for the
publishing many books. These are incredible invitations for serendipity, and so who's to say where it takes you from here?
Knock on wood, eh? Knock on wood.
All right, mate.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic
That's a lot
book.
of fun.
Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today, and for being open and generous with your responses. It was really fun to talk to you.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. I hopefully do it again for the next book.